The mistake that changed history. The Eastern Front is remembered as a battlefield of staggering brutality, a place where entire armies vanished, where cities were ground into dust, and where millions of soldiers on both sides fought in conditions no human should ever endure. But behind all the carnage, behind all the tanks, artillery, and frozen trenches, there was one decision, one single strategic miscalculation that ensured Germany would never win the war. It was not Stalingrad. It was not Kursk. It was not Moscow. Those disasters came later. The real mistake happened before the first shot was fired in Operation Barbarossa. A mistake born of arrogance, racism, and catastrophic overconfidence. And in the summer of 1941, that mistake doomed the German army long before winter ever arrived. As the Eastern Front was broken before it began, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, it was the largest invasion in human history. 3.8 million Axis soldiers, over 600,000 vehicles, 3,350 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,700 aircraft, and a front stretching more than 1,800 miles. No military in the world had ever attempted something so enormous. And yet, the entire plan rested on a series of assumptions, all of them fatally wrong. German high command believed, 1. The Red Army would collapse in 8 to 12 weeks. 2. The Soviet Union had no industrial depth. 3. The Slavic population would not resist. 4. Soviet leadership would fall apart instantly. 5. Germany could win a continental war with no long-term economic planning. Every one of these assumptions was false, dangerously false. But Hitler built his entire campaign around them, and as soon as the invasion began, the cracks appeared. The key mistake: Hitler misunderstood the Soviet Union. To understand the magnitude of Hitler's error, we have to understand how he viewed the Soviet Union. Hitler believed Russia was a giant on clay feet. The Red Army was poorly led. Soviet industry was backward. The population was racially inferior and incapable of resistance. A single heavy blow would shatter the entire system. This was not military analysis. This was ideology. Racist ideology replaced logic. Political hatred replaced intelligence. Wishful thinking replaced planning. So Germany prepared for a campaign designed to last weeks, not years. They brought no winter clothing, no spare engines, insufficient ammunition reserves, and a supply system incapable of supporting a long war. They believed they would crush the Soviet Union's military before logistics mattered. They didn't understand that the Soviet Union had built a war machine designed to survive catastrophe. And that misunderstanding, that colossal underestimation, was the single greatest mistake of the Eastern Front. The first signs of trouble. In the first 10 days of the invasion, Germany achieved spectacular victories. Thousands of tanks destroyed, hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken. Soviet armies shattered across the frontier. German commanders were convinced their assumptions were correct. But even in this moment of triumph, signs of disaster were already emerging. 1. The Soviets did not collapse. Units that should have broken reformed and counterattacked. 2. Reserves appeared that Germany didn't know existed. Entire divisions materialized seemingly from nowhere. 3. Soviet industry kept producing. Factories east of the Urals were packed into trains and moved out of German reach. 4. Logistics were already strained. German trucks broke down in the dust and heat. The supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Fuel shortages appeared in July, not winter. 5. German soldiers began to realize the horrifying truth. The Soviet Union was far bigger, far tougher, and far more resilient than they had been told. But Hitler refused to adjust. He doubled down. And the splitting of Army Group Center, a fatal error. By August 1941, German Army Group Center had smashed its way deep into the western USSR. It stood only 200 miles from Moscow, with the Soviet capital vulnerable and disorganized. German generals, Bach, Guderian, and others, begged Hitler to order an all-out drive on Moscow. They believed taking the capital could cripple Soviet command and control. Instead, Hitler issued the most disastrous order of the campaign. Army Group Center will split its forces and turn north toward Leningrad and south toward Ukraine. This single decision took pressure off Moscow, gave the Red Army time to regroup, allowed new Siberian divisions to arrive, stretched German supply lines even thinner, cost precious time before winter. It was a catastrophic misuse of momentum. One German officer later said, "We defeated ourselves the moment we turned away from Moscow." Another wrote, "The war was lost in August." The ideological blunder, treating Soviets as subhuman. But the worst part of Hitler's mistake wasn't strategic. It was ideological. Nazi leadership believed the Slavic population would welcome Germany as liberators from Stalin. Instead, German occupation forces starved civilians, burned villages, executed political officers, massacred Jews, enslaved populations for labor, destroyed farms, treated locals as animals. This ensured the Soviet people did not surrender. They resisted with everything they had. Partisans formed across Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. Entire regions became hostile. Supply lines were attacked constantly. Railroads were blown up nightly. German divisions were pinned down, guarding logistics instead of fighting at the front. Hitler had created a nightmare of his own making. The Red Army reorganizes and grows stronger. While Germany fought with shrinking resources, the Soviet Union did the opposite. They raised 400 new divisions, moved 1,523 factories east, expanded tank production massively, trained new officers, built fresh armies behind the Ural Mountains. Germany believed it had destroyed the Soviet army. In reality, it had destroyed the first Soviet army, not the second, and definitely not the third. Stalin mobilized another force, larger than anything Germany had ever faced. The mistake was now irreversible. The German mistake that ruined the Eastern Front. The moment the invasion stalled by late August 1941, the German advance was slowing. What had begun as a lightning strike across the Soviet frontier was now becoming a grinding war of exhaustion. Thousands of vehicles lay abandoned on Soviet roads, their engines seized, their tires shredded, their suspensions collapsed from endless marching. The German army had expected victory before logistics became a problem. Instead, supply columns were collapsing long before Moscow came into sight. And suddenly, the truth became unavoidable. Germany was not strong enough to defeat the Soviet Union in one campaign. But Hitler refused to hear it. The decision to turn south and the price of delay. In early August, while Army Group Center stood poised to strike at Moscow, Hitler became obsessed with seizing Ukraine's resources. Its wheat, its coal, its iron, its oil, its factories. He ordered 2 entire panzer groups, the most powerful armored formations in the Wehrmacht, to turn away from Moscow. It was a decision driven by emotion and ideology, not strategy. He wanted Ukraine's land. He wanted the Donbass industrial region. He wanted to starve the Soviet Union by seizing its breadbasket. But this shift had devastating consequences. 1. The drive on Moscow stopped cold. The Soviets used the time to build multiple defensive belts around the capital. 2. Panzer units spent precious fuel marching hundreds of extra miles. Germany had no fuel reserves to waste. 3. Thousands of vehicles broke down. Some panzer divisions lost a third of their strength before reaching new battle lines. 4. The Soviets raised fresh armies. Divisions formed in Siberia, the Urals, and Central Asia began arriving on the front. 5. Hitler lost the one thing Germany needed most: momentum. German generals knew it instantly. The turn to Kiev has cost us the war. But Hitler saw the capture of Kiev where 665,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled, as proof that he was right. He didn't understand that the Red Army could replace men far faster than Germany could. For every Soviet soldier captured, another appeared with a rifle and orders to hold. The approach to Moscow, too little, too late. When Hitler finally ordered the drive on Moscow to resume in late September, the strategic window had already closed. The Wehrmacht launched Operation Typhoon, a massive push aimed at capturing the Soviet capital before the autumn rains began. And at first, it seemed like another triumph. Vyazma encircled. Bryansk encircled, hundreds of thousands of prisoners. German units advancing toward Mozhaisk. But time was no longer on their side. 1. The weather turned. The Rasputitsa, the mud season, arrived. Roads vanished beneath oceans of mud. Trucks sank axle deep. Tanks bogged down. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. The German advance slowed to a crawl. 2. Ammunition ran out. Some infantry units received only 9 bullets per soldier per day. 3. Fuel was rationed violently. Some tanks were abandoned because their gasoline was needed for others. 4. Food shortages became severe. Troops survived on 800 calories a day. Many collapsed from hunger. 5. Winter arrived early. By late October, temperatures plunged below freezing. Lubricants hardened. Engines refused to start. Gunbolts froze. All because Germany had assumed the campaign would end in August. The Soviet capital, once weeks away from collapse, now stood behind layers of defenses, held by fresh Siberian divisions, hardened by Arctic winters. Germany had lost the race. The Siberian divisions arrive. In November 1941, Soviet intelligence confirmed something Stalin had feared for months. Japan was not going to attack the USSR. With the eastern border secure, Stalin made a decision that stunned the Germans. He transferred 18 Siberian divisions, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft to the defense of Moscow. These troops were trained in extreme cold, disciplined, well-equipped, led by experienced officers. And most importantly, they were fresh. German divisions had been fighting continuously for 5 months. Soviet Siberian divisions had not fired a shot. The scales were about to tip. Hitler's misunderstanding of the Soviet people. Hitler believed the Soviet population would crumble under pressure. Instead, the invasion had the opposite effect. 1. Soviet women filled factories. Millions of women worked 12, 14-hour shifts, producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition. 2. Soviet partisans became a major force. They attacked rail lines, bridges, convoys, and fuel depots. German logistics never recovered. 3. Soviet morale hardened. Rather than collapse, the population accepted unimaginable sacrifice. One historian wrote, Hitler united the Soviet Union in a way Stalin never could. The invasion was so brutal, so filled with massacres, starvation, and cruelty, that surrender became unthinkable. This was not the weak, collapsing enemy Hitler had imagined. This was a nation fighting for survival. Tschatzing and the failure of German logistics, a nightmare unfolding. Germany had prepared equipment for a short summer war. Thin lubricants, weak antifreeze, no snowplows, no winter tents, no insulated boots, no heavy coats, engines designed for mild European climates. By November, the Wehrmacht was freezing to death. Horses, still the backbone of German supply, died in thousands. Infantry marched in summer uniforms. Many wrapped their feet in newspapers or rags. Weapons jammed. Artillery wouldn't fire. Medical supplies froze solid. Meanwhile, the Soviets had winter clothing, winter tanks, winter fuel, winter tactics. Germany was fighting both the Red Army and the environment. It was a war they were not equipped to win. The final push toward Moscow. In early December 1941, German soldiers fought to within 10 to 12 miles of Moscow. They could see the outskirts of the city. Some reported seeing the glow of the Kremlin in the distance, but they were done. Frostbite ravaged their ranks. Ammunition ran low. Tanks were immobile. Commanders begged for supplies that never came. Divisions shrank to half strength. And now, the Red Army struck back. The Soviet Winter Counteroffensive. On December 5th to 6th, 1941, Soviet forces launched a massive counterattack along the entire Moscow front. The effect was immediate and devastating. German units collapsed, entire regiments fled, equipment was abandoned in the snow. Commanders reported, "We can no longer hold. We are frozen in place." It was the first major defeat of the German army in the war. And the reason for the defeat was the same as the mistake made before the invasion. Hitler had underestimated the Soviet Union in every possible way. The German mistake that ruined the Eastern Front was the moment Hitler lost the war. December 1941 was the turning point. Not Stalingrad, not Kursk, not Berlin. The war in the East was effectively lost the moment Germany failed to capture Moscow before winter. Everything that followed, every battle, every campaign, every retreat, was damage control. The German army, once unstoppable, was now facing a reality it had never been prepared for. A two-front war against enemies with greater manpower, greater industry, and greater endurance. And the cause of this disaster went back to that single, catastrophic misunderstanding of the Soviet Union. The German High Command realizes the truth. Throughout December and January, messages flooded into the German High Command. Units are freezing in the trenches. Machine guns will not fire. No fuel available for armored counterattacks. Horses dying by the thousands. Soldiers have no winter coats. We cannot hold without reinforcements. Generals who had once believed in swift victory now face the consequences of Hitler's arrogance. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch collapsed under the stress and was dismissed. His replacement? Hitler himself. From that moment onward, strategy was no longer guided by professional soldiers. It was guided by Hitler's ideology, anger, and paranoia. The mistake that ruined the Eastern Front had now become permanent. Hitler takes direct control and makes everything worse. Once Hitler personally took command of the army, he made decisions that defied logic and military sense. 1. No retreat under any circumstances. Even when withdrawal could save divisions, Hitler refused. Entire units froze to death because they were ordered to stand still. 2. He micromanaged divisions from 800 miles away. He directed regiments he had never seen on terrain he had never studied. 3. He ignored reports from the front. Officers who spoke honestly risked being removed or court-martialed. 4. He believed Soviet victories were temporary illusions. When Soviet armies advanced, Hitler insisted they were exhausted. 5. He assumed the USSR would collapse any day. This delusion lasted until 1945. All of this made the original mistake explode into a disaster of historic proportions. In the failure to prepare for long war, Germany had planned its entire invasion based on a summer victory. Ammunition stocks for 12 weeks, fuel reserves for 8 to 10 weeks of operations, maintenance capacity for short campaigns, engine designs unsuited for extreme cold, clothing supplies for warm weather. By January 1942, the Wehrmacht was stuck in a war it had prepared for incorrectly. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had deeper reserves, more factories, more manpower, more territory, more political control, and, crucially, a population willing to endure unimaginable suffering. Germany was not prepared to fight an enemy like this. Certainly not for years, and definitely not without allies capable of matching Soviet production. The strength of the Soviet war machine. Germany believed it was fighting a primitive, backward opponent. In reality, the Soviet Union had 1. The largest tank factory in the world, Uralvagonzavod. By 1942, It was producing T-34 tanks in enormous numbers. 2. A military-industrial complex impossible to reach. Factories east of the Urals were completely beyond German bombers. 3. An ability to move entire industries thousands of miles in record time. 4. A government capable of mobilizing everything: human lives, labor, resources, infrastructure. 5. A political system that tolerated levels of sacrifice no democracy could ever accept. This was not the weak enemy Hitler imagined. This was the perfect enemy for a long war, and Germany had started a war it was incapable of finishing. At the cost of Hitler's policy of brutality, German occupation was so violent that it fueled an explosion of resistance behind the front lines. Partisan warfare increased massively. Bridges destroyed, trains derailed, supply depots burned, commanders assassinated, German convoys ambushed daily, fuel shipments hijacked, communication lines cut repeatedly. By 1943, some German divisions had to use half their manpower just to protect supply routes. The more brutal the occupation became, the more determined the Soviet people grew. An officer wrote, "Wherever we step, the land rises against us." Hitler's ideological hatred created a war Germany could never win. Not with tanks, not with artillery, not with planes. Because the Soviet Union was not just defending its government. It was defending its very existence. The German industry could not keep up. Germany was a highly industrialized nation, but it was far too small to compete with the Soviet Union in a long attritional war. Germany produced 3,052 tanks in 1941, 5,180 tanks in 1942. The Soviet Union produced 6,590 tanks in 1941, 24,100 tanks in 1942. That is not a typo. In the year Germany expected to win the war, the USSR increased tank output by 365%. By 1943, the Red Army had more tanks than Germany could ever hope to destroy. The numbers alone meant one thing: Germany had already lost the war of production. German generals admit the truth. After the war, numerous German commanders spoke openly about the true cause of their defeat. Guderian said, "The moment we failed to capture Moscow before winter, the war was lost." Halder said, "We underestimated the Soviets completely. Our intelligence was wrong in every measure." Manstein said, "Hitler's refusal to retreat cost us entire armies." Even Hitler himself admitted in private, "We were not prepared for a war of such scale." The disaster was undeniable. The mistake at the heart of it was the same mistake Germany made in planning the invasion. They believed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. It didn't. And once it didn't, the war was unwinnable. The human cost, a war of extinction. By 1942, the Eastern Front had become something far worse than a normal military conflict. It was a war of destruction, a war of ideology, a war where both sides accepted immense suffering. Human losses were staggering. Millions dead, cities burned, entire regions depopulated, civilians executed, POWs starved, entire armies wiped out. But the Soviet Union did not break, because survival, not victory, became the only acceptable outcome. This was something Germany never understood until it was far too late. So the last pieces fall into place. By early 1942, 3 facts were clear. 1. Germany could not defeat the USSR in a short war. The initial plan had failed. 2. Germany did not have the industrial capacity for a long war. Chatten 3. Hitler's refusal to make strategic adjustments guaranteed disaster. And with that, the Eastern Front became a slow-motion catastrophe. Germany had launched a war it could never sustain, and the world was about to watch it unravel. The German mistake that ruined the Eastern Front. From the moment, the Red Army turned the tide. By early 1942, the Red Army was no longer collapsing. It was reorganizing, reinforcing, learning, expanding, and adapting faster than German intelligence ever believed possible. The Soviets had endured the worst disaster in their nation's military history and survived it. Now, they were ready to fight back. Not as the disorganized, panicked force of June 1941, but as a hardened army capable of mass mobilization, high-speed redeployment, and industrial warfare. Germany had expected to destroy the Red Army in 8 weeks. Instead, they had awakened a giant, and that giant was now angry. The winter of 1941-42 breaks the Wehrmacht. The winter counteroffensive around Moscow shattered the myth of German invincibility. German units that had once stormed across Europe were now fighting for survival. Frostbite casualties exceeded $100,000. Entire divisions operated at 40% strength. Some infantry regiments had fewer than 300 men left. Tank units fought with only 5 to 10 operational vehicles. Artillery pieces burst from the cold. The Soviets pushed the Germans back 20, 40, sometimes 100 miles in a matter of weeks. And for the first time, the German High Command confronted the truth. This was no longer a blitzkrieg. This was a war of attrition, and Germany could not win a war of attrition. Now the Soviet Union learns to fight better. While German strength declined, the Red Army improved dramatically. 1. Command structures stabilized. Officers were trained and promoted rapidly. Experience replaced political fear. 2. New armored tactics emerged. Combined arms groups began coordinating. Tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, aircraft on a scale Germany couldn't match. 3. Industrial output soared. Entire factories that had been moved east were now in full production. T-34 tanks rolling out in thousands, Katyusha rocket batteries, Yak and Lay GG fighters, 76 mm guns and heavy artillery. 4. Morale skyrocketed. The victory at Moscow proved the Germans could be stopped. The Soviet population gained confidence. 5. Logistics improved. More trucks, more rail lines, better winter equipment, better food supplies. The Soviets were transforming a shattered army into a machine built for total war. Hitler doubles down on failure. Instead of adapting, Hitler committed the second great blunder of the Eastern Front. He assumed the USSR was nearly finished, even after escaping destruction in 1941. He convinced himself that the Red Army was one blow away from collapse. One more summer offensive, he said, would finish the job. He ignored depleted manpower, crippled logistics, fuel shortages, lack of reserves, exhausted formations, overstretched fronts. He dismissed the advice of the General Staff and ordered a new offensive, Operation Blue, Fall Blau, in 1942. This decision would lead directly to Stalingrad and the destruction of an entire German army. The drive to the Caucasus, another strategic nightmare. In 1942, Hitler shifted the main effort south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. He believed seizing Soviet oil would starve the Red Army of fuel. Instead, he repeated the same mistake he made in 1941. He split his forces again. Some divisions went to Stalingrad. Others went to the Caucasus. Neither had enough strength to finish the job. The result, 2 overstretched offensives, thin supply lines, massive Soviet counterattacks, divisions isolated and vulnerable. The mistake of dividing Army Group Center in 1941 reappeared on an even larger scale in 1942. And the fate of the 6th Army, a direct consequence of Hitler's error. When German troops reached Stalingrad, what should have been a limited operation became a monstrous, city-destroying siege. The Soviets poured endless reinforcements into the ruins. Factories kept running while battles raged around them. Fresh troops crossed the Volga daily. While Hitler obsessed over taking the city, Soviet generals planned a massive encirclement. The result? Operation Uranus. Complete encirclement of the German Sixth Army. 300,000 Axis troops trapped. The greatest disaster in German military history. The collapse at Stalingrad was not an accident. It was the direct result of the original mistake of 1941. Germany believed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. It never prepared for long war. Stalingrad was the bill coming due. The Long War grinds Germany to dust. Between 1943 and 1945, Germany suffered defeat at Kursk, collapse in Ukraine, loss of the Baltic states, destruction of Army Group Center, retreat across Poland, encirclement in East Prussia, fall of Berlin. And all of these defeats share one root cause. Germany underestimated the Soviet Union so severely that its entire campaign was built on fantasy. Once the fantasy collapsed, Germany had no plan, no reserves, and no strategy to recover. The math of total war, why Germany could never win. By 1943, the numbers made German defeat inevitable. Manpower. USSR mobilized 34 million people. Germany mobilized 17 million tanks. USSR produced 100,000 tanks. Germany produced 146,000 artillery. USSR produced 516,000 guns. Germany produced 159,000 aircraft. USSR 137,000. Germany 119,000 territory. Germany fought on 400,000 square miles of occupied USSR with endless partisan warfare. The Soviets fought on home territory with internal supply lines. The imbalance was destructive. Germany had started a war it was mathematically incapable of winning. The final truth. The Eastern Front was lost before it began. Historians still debate, was it logistics? Was it the winter? Was it Stalingrad? Was it Hitler's interference? Was it the resilience of the Red Army? Was it Soviet industry? All were important. But they came after the true fatal mistake. Hitler never understood the Soviet Union. He misunderstood its people, its leadership, its military, its industrial might, its ability to relocate factories, its willingness to sacrifice. He believed ideology, racism, and willpower could defeat economics, geography, and manpower. This miscalculation set the stage for every disaster that followed. Now to the conclusion, how a single misunderstanding doomed an empire operation. Barbarossa did not fail because of winter, or mud, or distance, or resistance, or even bad luck. It failed because Germany attacked a country it fundamentally did not understand, and because Hitler believed a lie about what the Soviet Union was and what it was capable of becoming. Once the Red Army survived 1941, the war was over, even if it took 4 more years for the world to see it. The mistake was not a tactical error, not a strategic misstep, not a miscommunication. It was a flaw in worldview, and it cost Germany the greatest war in human history.